In 2011, a devastating mega-drought scorched the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico. Across the cracked ground, thousands of domestic cattle collapsed from exhaustion. A cattle economy worth millions of dollars completely fell apart. But right in the center of that devastation, cameras captured an impossible scene. 23 giant creatures weighing nearly a ton each not only survived spectacularly, but were also reproducing. They did not need humans to bring them water. They did not need chemicals, and they were quietly activating one of the greatest ecosystem restoration campaigns in North American history. So what really happened when these 23 outsiders were released into a land that seemed to have already collapsed? More than 200 years ago, before barbed wire fences or national borders, northern Mexico was a deep green ocean of grass connected to the United States. This grassland did not flourish by accident. It was a closed operating system, where every animal had its own role. On the surface, millions of bison moved across the land with thunderous force. They grazed, trimming the vegetation in a steady rhythm. Running across the grasses were pronghorns, the second fastest land animals in the world. Underground, millions of prairie dogs dug networks of tunnels, stretching for kilometers, loosening the soil, and guiding rainwater deep into the ground. Though their bodies were small, they were among the hardest working soil builders. The tunnels dug by prairie dogs brought air into the soil, and helped rainwater soak deeper. At the same time, bison dung on the surface became natural fertilizer, helping grass roots grow stronger. This perfect combination created an abundant food supply. It supported countless birds, rodents, and predators. Wherever prairie dog burrows existed, life overflowed. And then, that sea of grass disappeared. The grassland did not decline because of natural disaster or weather. It collapsed because of uncontrolled human exploitation. In the late 19th century, humans drove tens of thousands of domestic cattle into this region, treating the grassland like a free gold mine. Very quickly, natural bison populations declined severely because of hunting and because land was being cleared for massive domestic cattle herds. But the damage did not stop there. In the eyes of cattle ranchers, prairie dogs were the reason food was being lost. They ate grass and dug holes that could make cattle slip, fall, and break their legs. So humans decided this species had to be removed. For many years after that, the governments of the United States and Mexico poured money into a large-scale ecological extermination campaign. Heavy industrial chemicals were pumped directly into underground cities. Millions of prairie dogs were wiped out in only a few months. Above ground, overloaded cattle herds trampled the soil and chewed the grass down to the roots. The foundation broke, and the grassland began to die. No bison remained to spread seeds. No prairie dogs remained to loosen the soil. The foundation of the ecosystem had been completely destroyed. Humans had deformed the grassland with their own hands, but at the time, ranchers simply walked away, unaware of one truth: by breaking the ecological balance, they had also cut off their own future livelihood. Every mistaken intervention in the environment leaves consequences behind. And when an ecosystem loses balance, the economic price becomes enormous. Look at these cold numbers. North America has lost more than 90% of its original grasslands and 90% of its prairie dog populations. This is not a natural shift. This is a systematic collapse. Without deep grass roots holding the soil together, the strong winds of the Chihuahuan region began stripping away the fertile topsoil. The land dried out rapidly. Thorny mesquite shrubs invaded, marking a process of desertification that became extremely difficult to reverse. and the collapse of nature pulled the local economy down with it. Ranch owners who once calculated huge profits from massive cattle herds suddenly found themselves trapped. By the late 20th century, profits from the livestock industry were falling sharply. Dry land could no longer grow new grass. Cattle became thin, weak, and nutritionally deprived. The ranchers, who once thought they had mastered this land, were now being pushed by that very land to the edge of bankruptcy. The real culprit was not only poison, but the way humans grazed domestic cattle. Why did the grass disappear? Look at how a domestic cow eats. When released into open land, cattle tend to gather in one area. They graze, then graze again, chewing the grass down almost to the last root. Before the grass can recover, it loses its ability to grow back. But the greatest impact is beneath their feet. The hooves of domestic cattle are large, heavy, and flat. Tens of thousands of cattle with massive body weight moving every day compressed the topsoil. The soil became so compacted that it hardened like a layer of concrete. When rain falls on ground like that, what happens? Water cannot soak down to feed plant roots or refill groundwater. Instead, it runs straight across the surface, washing away the last remaining fertile particles of humus. No prairie dogs remain to loosen the soil. Domestic cattle press the soil down even harder. Grass is grazed to the roots. Rainwater runs off. That is a perfect chain reaction for turning a green grassland into dry, barren land. The fault was not a sudden climate shift. The fault lay in the way humans extracted every last value from the land. By the 1980s and 90s, northern Mexico could not recover. But ecologists Gerardo Ceballos and Rudy List found a ray of hope. A rare prairie dog population was still surviving. The grassland was not dead. It was exhausted. To save it, science needed two practical weapons: money and law. The international conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy, made a bold decision. It used a large budget to purchase ownership of a massive cattle ranch located right in the heart of the Janos region, called Rancho El Uno. They converted this former grazing area into a large-scale field research center. In 2009, the Mexican government established the Janos Biosphere Reserve, protecting more than 526,000 hectares. But protecting land was not enough. To restore the lost ecological functions, the project brought 23 genetically valuable bison from Wind Cave National Park to Rancho El Uno. From that moment, Janos began testing whether bison could reactivate the grassland system after more than a century of absence. Many people will ask, if this is conservation, why not simply leave the land alone? Why bring back giant creatures weighing nearly a ton? The answer is direct: a broken ecosystem must be reactivated by its core component. Bison are not merely grazing animals, they are natural soil working tools, perfected by evolution over millions of years. Unlike the flat hooves of domestic cattle, bison hooves are compact and extremely sharp. When they move, pressure is concentrated into these contact points, working like biological drills. They pierce the hardened soil crust and loosen the ground without creating heavy compaction. Air and moisture once again have a chance to enter beneath the surface. In addition, their wild behavior keeps them moving constantly as a herd. They consume the tops of grasses and move on immediately, leaving the roots intact so the grass can quickly regenerate. Most special of all is their wallowing behavior. Bison often roll on the ground to clean their bodies. Their enormous weight creates wide depressions across the soil surface. When rainstorms arrive, these structures act like natural water storage basins. They reduce evaporation and runoff, creating microhabitats for amphibians, birds, and insects during the dry season. And finally, their digestive system. Bison consume a diverse range of vegetation. Their dung contains large amounts of native grass seeds that have not been fully digested. Wherever the herd moves, they spread this genetic material across the land. The soil is loosened, water is stored, and seeds are naturally planted. Bison do not merely live on the grassland. The grassland ecosystem exists because of bison. However, bison are not an automatic restoration tool. If they are kept at too high a density, in a small area, they can also degrade vegetation. The results at Janos depend at the same time on land area, rainfall, herd size, and management methods. Only 1 year after the 23 bison were brought into the Rancho El Uno Reserve, the dry land began showing signs of recovery. Although their numbers were still very limited, their physical impact on the soil had already begun to work. The hardened compacted soil layer was broken. Deep-rooted native grasses began to germinate and rise. Water basins created by bison held standing water longer after rainfall, restoring local microbial chains. Then, the most important biological milestone was confirmed. In spring, the first F1 generation bison calves were born directly within the Janos ecosystem. For the first time in more than a century, bison officially reproduced naturally on Mexican territory. They adapted perfectly to the harsh environment without any medical intervention. The rewilding process had achieved its first success, and researchers collected their most positive data yet. But climate change does not follow human plans. Just as the ecological indicators began to rise, an extreme weather event struck, threatening to reverse the entire project. In 2011, the worst Mega-Drought in decades swept across the Chihuahuan region. Temperatures surged, moisture evaporated rapidly, surface water sources dried up, and vegetation stopped growing completely. Thousands of domestic cattle suffered heavy losses from exhaustion and lack of water. Livestock collapsed across the red soil. Ranchers who depended entirely on natural resources faced the greatest crisis of their lives. They stood on the edge of mass bankruptcy. And when the economic damage reached its peak, social pressure immediately increased. Attention focused on the boundary of the Janos Biosphere Reserve. Outside the fence, commercial livestock were running out of life-supporting resources. Inside the fence, vegetation was still being maintained for wild animals. This contrast triggered fierce reactions. Cattle ranchers held multiple tense dialogues with government officials. Conflicts of interest became intense. Agricultural representatives demanded that the reserve be opened for grazing, threatened legal action to reclaim the land fund, and even suggested eliminating wild animals to make room for cattle. In reality, ecological conservation always comes with trade-offs. It is a complex process where the survival space of wildlife directly collides with the livelihood needs of humans. The peak of tension at local meetings was silenced by a ruthless set of data. Despite the extreme drought, the bison herd remained healthy, while domestic cattle collapsed. Why? Because evolutionary adaptation saved them. When high-quality grass became scarce, bison were able to switch to rough, low-nutrient plants that ordinary cattle could not digest well. Their metabolism optimized water use. They moved continuously across large areas to spread pressure instead of gathering in one place and exhausting resources. Ranchers realized that their unsustainable extraction model could not withstand extreme weather. If they continued maintaining high grazing density, economic collapse was certain. Ecologists proposed a transition plan: do not remove the wild bison, but apply the principles behind their behavior. The reserve proposed transferring rotational grazing techniques to farmers, by adjusting the density of cattle herds, and constantly moving grazing areas to imitate the migration behavior of wild bison. The land would be given recovery cycles. From fierce confrontation, a cooperation agreement was signed. Both sides recognized the core principle: ecological restoration is the only infrastructure that can guarantee long-term stability for the agricultural economy. But one important link in Janos had been brought back even before the bison. In 2001, the black-footed ferret Mustela nigrips was reintroduced to the Janos region. This happened 8 years before the 23 bison arrived at Rancho El Uno. That sequence shows that the Janos restoration did not begin with a single species, and it did not unfold in a straight line. Black-footed ferrets depend almost entirely on prairie dogs. They hunt prairie dogs for food, and use abandoned prairie dog tunnels as shelter, breeding sites, and protection from harsh weather. If prairie dog populations decline, black-footed ferrets lose both their food and their home. Meanwhile, bison affect a different layer of the system. They change grass height, nutrient distribution, and create wallows. Prairie dogs continue digging burrows and keeping many areas in a short grass state. These two groups of animals create a more diverse landscape together, but through different mechanisms. Prairie dog burrows are also used by burrowing owls, Athene cunicularia, along with many reptiles and small animals. In the sky, golden eagles and other birds of prey depend on the prey base that survives around these colonies. So, the return of bison did not directly pull black-footed ferrets or birds of prey back. More accurately, bison added a lost function into a restoration system that had already begun. Janos has not fully restored its historical biodiversity network, but projects for prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, bison, and pronghorn are gradually bringing separated links back together. Success does not lie in how many species appear in one year, but in whether ecological relationships can survive across many generations. The recovery of the Janos region is not measured only through biological indicators or economic reports. It marks a deep shift in community awareness. Historically, for indigenous communities in North America, bison held a central place in social structure. They were a core symbol of the land, providing a material foundation and carrying enormous spiritual meaning. When territorial expansion unfolded in the 19th century, the decline of bison did not only break the food web, it also severed the most important connection between indigenous people and their living environment. Today, as wildlife populations stabilize again, a change in perspective is also happening among the people who directly use this land. Ranchers in Chihuahua, people who once saw the conservation project as a threat to their livelihood, have now completely changed their attitude. From calling the wild animals government interference, they have shifted to recognizing their long-term ecological value. Seeing vegetation recover during the drought proved something to them. Biodiversity conservation does not limit economic development. On the contrary, it creates sustainability for their own livestock industry. The long-running conflict over land resource management has found a shared technical solution. The practical value of the Janos project extends beyond the region itself. It provides important data for global climate change response efforts. In greenhouse gas reduction strategies, attention often focuses on reforestation. However, forest ecosystems carry a major physical risk. Most stored carbon is above ground. When fire occurs, much of that biomass burns and releases large amounts of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. By contrast, grassland ecosystems operate through a special mechanism. Temperate grasslands store most of their carbon, up to 80%, in deep root systems and underground microorganisms. If a surface fire occurs, this underground carbon store remains protected, and plants can regenerate quickly from living roots. In reality, grasslands are among the safest and most effective carbon storage systems on the planet. The Janos model serves as a standard blueprint. It provides real-world evidence that ecosystems degraded by overgrazing can be restored if we accurately re-establish their natural operating components. Successfully applying this model opens major potential for restoring desertified lands around the world. The greatest success of Janos is not turning a dry region into a green paradise. It proves that a small founding population can restore a lost ecological function if the habitat is large enough and managed over the long term. But the next challenge is far harder: expanding recovery beyond the boundary of a single reserve. Bison, pronghorn, and predators do not recognize ranch fences or national borders. If they cannot move between habitats, a growing herd still does not mean the ecosystem is truly healthy. So the question of Janos is no longer whether 23 bison can survive. The question is whether humans can give enough space for the recovery process to continue. If you are interested in ecological restoration projects, or the complex mechanisms behind natural food chains, click the video now appearing on the screen. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for the latest scientific reports on the global environment. I will see you again in the next analysis.